Thank you so much, Bryce, for that prayer, and thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll begin our study of Colossians this morning. I know I handed you several questions and sort of, they were split into sections, and there's an introductory section. I'm probably just going to, not ignore those questions, but just blow through those questions right quick myself by way of introduction to the letter. And then I'll get into parceling out questions, or at least tossing them out there for you to take as we get into the actual chapter content. So first, just a quick word about the city of Colossae. If you take a look at the map of the Roman world that we're accustomed to seeing, we're going to zoom in on a place right here in Asia Minor, and there are Colossae, along with Laodicea and Hierapolis. Now, Colossae had been kind of a big deal in the centuries shortly before the birth of Jesus, but by the time that we catch up to this point, the time in which Paul is writing to the Colossians, it had declined a bit. In part because of a change in the road systems. Maybe you've seen that Disney Pixar movie Cars, where they were along Route 66 and they were a thriving town, and then the interstate comes through and is on a different route, and all the traffic passes them by. Well, sort of the same sort of thing happened to Colossae. Still a city of some prominence, but not nearly the prominence that they had before that. Furthermore, during the time of Antiochus III, he had a number of Jewish families moved to, had them moved. I sort of enticed them to move is the idea that I get. Made them some promises of some things that he would give them if they would move to that area. And so there was a certain Jewish contingent there. As we consider the time of writing, of course, we group this in with the prison epistles. One of the things that he says here in Colossians 4, verse 10, talking about Aristarchus, he calls him my fellow prisoner. And so between this and the similarity that is often noted between Ephesians and Colossians with regard to their content, and finally, a number of common names between the letters to the Colossians and the one to Philemon, for instance. Archippus, Onesimus, Epaphras, Mark, Aristarchus, I already mentioned, Demas, Luke, probably written about the same time, probably written while Paul is in prison there in Rome, that first imprisonment. Now, Paul, as we pick up on, as we move into chapter 2, he says that the people in Colossae have not seen his face. Now, he's heard about things there. Epaphras has brought him a report, but if Paul himself has not seen the faces of these brethren, where did this church come from? We know that Paul had moved through the area of Phrygia, which is this area here where, let's try again, there we go. This area here where Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis all sit. If you were from Phrygia, you were probably from one of those cities, that sort of a tri-cities area. Well, Paul hadn't been there himself, although he had probably passed through. He either just didn't stay very long in Colossae, or the teaching didn't take, or whatever. So it appears from looking at the text that it was probably Epaphras. He was the one who probably took the gospel to Colossae and began establishing the church there, perhaps even in Laodicea and Hierapolis, since they were so close there, such near neighbors there. So we look at Colossians 1, verses 6 through 8. He talks about the gospel that's come to you, as it has also in all the world, bringing forth fruit, as it has since the day that you heard of it. In verse 7, as you also learned from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf, who also declared to us your love in the Spirit. So Epaphras apparently took the gospel there, established the church, and then is bringing this report back to Paul. Walton Weaver, who wrote the Guardian of Truth commentary on Colossians, he speculates that Paul probably converted Epaphras himself. And in fact, if you'll notice there too, Ephesus is not too far. So here we are in Colossae. Ephesus is not too far away. In fact, there had been a main road, still a fairly prominent road that went between Colossae and Ephesus. So it certainly stands to reason, especially when you look at the language there of Paul's time in Ephesus in Acts. It talks about how that all of Asia heard the gospel at that point. So certainly stands to reason that Epaphras, either through Paul directly or somehow getting word and then coming to Ephesus, whatever. Paul had converted Epaphras most likely, and then Epaphras took the gospel to Colossae. Now, regardless of how much of a hand Epaphras had in establishing the church there, I think that Colossians 4 verses 12 and 13 are really, really touching, really tell us a lot about who Epaphras is. Take a look there where he says, Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you, and those who are in Laodicea, and those in Hierapolis. So get a lot of insight, I think, into the kind of man Epaphras was. And I'll just have to admit, I'm not sure that anybody could say of Brad that he labors fervently in prayer for any particular thing. And that, I think there's a weakness in my prayer life. Do I labor fervently in prayers for not only for myself and whatever things that I'm dealing with, but for my family, for this church, for other churches that we have some connection to. So that I take that as a personal challenge here when I read about what Epaphras does there. As we move into the second question I posed there, who are the apparent couriers of the letter? I mean, Epaphras seems like he would be. Why don't we just send the letter back by Epaphras? He brought the report, send it back. Well, you look at Philemon, and I'm not going to step on Leonard's toes too much here, but you look at Philemon verse 23. It says he calls Epaphras my fellow prisoner. Don't know quite the nature of that imprisonment. Was it a genuine imprisonment, or was it, as some people have theorized, Aristarchus is also called a fellow prisoner later in this letter. Some have theorized that it might be kind of like, how you take turns at staying with a family member or a friend in the hospital. It seems as if perhaps these men, if they had not been taken against their will into prison, that they were sort of coming and staying with Paul, taking turns and helping him, trying to give him some comfort as he says about those who come and stay with him. So Epaphras doesn't take it, but we have there in chapter 4 in verses 7 through 9, we have a couple of people called out. Tychicus, a beloved brother, faithful minister, fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you all the news about me. So it sounds like he's probably carrying the letter along with another familiar name, with Onesimus down in verse 9, a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you. They will make known to you all things which are happening here. Let's see. We also, okay, again, not stepping on Leonard's toes. We'll have more to say about Onesimus, or Leonard will, when he teaches Philemon. But what we can say about Tychicus, don't know a whole lot about him. He's first mentioned in Acts chapter 20. Tychicus and Trophimus of Asia, among a list of people who were accompanying Paul on that third journey back to Jerusalem. Also, Tychicus, a beloved brother. The thing I want to bring out here is it wasn't simply that they were carrying this letter, but note how it says here, they'll tell you all about me. And it's for this, I'm sending him for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. And then later in verse 9, they will make known to you all things which are happening here. So as frequently appears to be the case with these couriers, yes, there are certain things that Paul wanted documented. He wanted said just right, and I need this to go to these people. But there will be some other matters that they talk about as well, and also get a sense for how they take that news and be able to bring that word back to Paul. What was the makeup of the church in Colossae? Well, I think we can get from a number of passages that it was mostly mostly Gentiles. Probably had some minority composition of Jews there, as I mentioned before, that there was something of a sizable number of Jews in that area, but probably mostly Gentiles. And we might cite four things here. The talk of outsiders being brought near. So similar language to what we see in Ephesians. Colossians 1, verse 21. And you who once were alienated and enemies in mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled. Colossians 1, 26 and 27, the famous verse from Colossians. The mystery which has been hidden from ages and from generations, but now has been revealed to his saints. To them God willed to make known what are the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Now, obviously, Christ in Jews is also the hope of glory as well, but with regard to the people that he's talking to here, hey, this is news. This is news that Christ can live in you as well. I don't know that I find this to be particularly compelling, but another thing that some people cite is distinctly Gentile vices when we get into chapter 3 in particular. Fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. Was that stuff not named among the Jews? Of course it was. Have you ever read the Old Testament? So, yeah, obviously. But maybe the focus there, and also he goes on to say in verse 6 there in chapter 3, because of these things the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. So this kind of language, the tenor of this language, tends to be associated more with Gentiles. Another thing that we find, or maybe I should say that we don't find, is how many quotes of the Old Testament do we find in Colossians? No direct quotes that I can find. Some allusions perhaps, but no direct quotes. And then furthermore, what tends to be something that is mentioned in just about every epistle? It's this friction between the Jews and Gentiles, and there's just not a lot mentioned there. We do have just one brief allusion to the idea, or one brief address of the idea in chapter 3, verse 11, where there's neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised. So there is a sense of unity that he's talking about there, but it does not appear that the Colossians deal with that head-to-head conflict that we saw so much, or that we see so much in some of the other epistles and the other churches there. All right. Something else that I want to bring out while we're doing some introductory things here. In question 4 here, what did Paul want done with this epistle? And what did he want done with the epistle to the Laodiceans? And he very clearly says, verse 16, see that it is read, that is to say, that this epistle, see that it's read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. So some people will talk about these epistles, and really this is just an effort to try to figure out some way of getting certain teachings not to apply to us. Can I just pull back the curtain and say that's what these people are trying to do? And they say, well, we're reading other people's mail here, and of course the picture that paints is kind of unseemly. Reading other people's mail, that feels kind of creepy. No. Paul wrote these letters. He wrote these letters with the intention. He knew that people were going to be reading these letters. He knew that we were going to be reading these letters. And so we're not doing anything unseemly. We are reading the words that Paul wants us to read. And as he says, I want the people in Laodicea to abide by these teachings. I want you to abide by the teachings that I'm giving to the Laodiceans. Paul talks about, Ephesians, I think, is one place where he talks about teaching the same thing in every place. So Paul wants us to read these things. We're not doing anything unseemly, and these teachings certainly apply to all of us. And finally, I'm going to put this one off until, maybe wait until, say, the first bell rings, or we might save it for the beginning of the next class. But I want to know what did you find as sort of a theme verse or a theme passage for the book of Colossians here? All right. Well, having done that sort of introductory work, let's get into the first chapter here. We have Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. Any question as to who wrote this letter? All right, good. Let's move on. To the faithful brethren in Christ, the saints and faithful brethren who are in Christ. Saints, faithful brethren. Same people. There's not two different classes of people. They're the same people who are in Colossae. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So very typical Pauline introduction. In fact, as we keep going, have another thing that's very typical for Paul. We give thanks to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, praying always for you. All right, so he's praying always for you. So here in this first question in the introduction, as I have it here, question number 6, what prompted Paul to give thanks? I mean, aside from the fact that Paul was clearly a man who spent a lot of time in prayer on behalf of the churches for whom he had such deep concern, what prompted him in particular with the Colossians to give such thanks?
Your faith in Christ Jesus and your love for all the saints, because of the hope that is in you. So faith, hope, and love.
Yep, there we go. Faith, hope, and love. That's good. In fact, I don't know if you went back and looked at your notes from 3 years ago, but I think that you answered a very similar question to this one when Andrew taught this, and I think you made some of the very same comments. So just so you know, Tony hasn't moved a bit. He's in exactly the same place that he was. And I don't mean moved in that he hasn't grown. I mean he hasn't drifted. So we're good. We're good there. All right. Yeah. Your faith. Notice too. I think that part of this is the gospel of Christ has reached the Colossians. I know we're all this way. But the delight that Paul seemed to take, similar to what John says, I delight to hear, I forget how he puts it, but he delights to hear his brethren walking in truth, or his children walking in truth, something like that. Paul is just thrilled to know that the gospel has reached some place that he has not himself had an opportunity to go. And so he's so happy for these people that they have received the gospel. And then as Tony says, faith, hope, and love, the hope that is laid up for you in heaven. He was just genuinely joyful on the Colossians' behalf that they now had this hope, a hope that Paul had and that he was hoping that he could give to everybody he came in contact with. I think, too, that he says there in verse 6, he talks about it, which has come to you as it has in all the world and is bringing forth fruit as it is also among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. So he's happy to hear from Epaphras' report. He's happy to hear not only have they heard the teaching, but they have embraced the teaching and their lives are demonstrating it. Now, I want to pause here for just a minute. Look at the wording that he has here, of which, let's see if we back up to verse 5, of which you heard in the word of the truth of the gospel, which has come to you, as it has also in all the world, and is bringing forth fruit. So it's bringing forth fruit in all the world, okay? The gospel's come to all the world, and it's bringing forth fruit in all the world. And then notice how he ties them and all the world together. As it is also among you, since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. I don't want to say that Paul is being disingenuous in his prayers. I think that he is and disingenuous in what he is reporting to these people. I think he is praying these things. This is why he is thankful as he prays. But I think that he's beginning to plant some seeds. He's beginning, if you will, before he does his full frontal assault against the false doctrine that the Colossians were having to deal with in chapter 2, he's sort of taking a beachhead here. He's bringing in artillery, and he's laying a foundation. So notice all of the things that he has to say as we make our way through the rest of chapter 1. All of the foundation that he lays before he finally brings that into contrast with what the false teachers are teaching. So number 1, it's having the gospel is bearing fruit in the world, and it's bearing the same fruit in all of you. Okay, you're just like everybody else. There's nothing. What's left unsaid here is there's nothing that you should have to add to what I've taught you that is going to allow you to bear fruit. What I've taught you is going to bear fruit. So just keep an eye out for those sorts of things. All right, as we move on into verses 9 through 11, so he says, for this reason we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you. So again, his ceaseless prayers. What does God, or rather what does Paul ask for God to grant to them as he makes these ceaseless prayers on their behalf?
That they would be filled with the knowledge of God's will,
okay,
all wisdom and understanding, and that they would walk worthy of the Lord, that they would be fruitful in every good work, increasing in the knowledge of God, and growing in strength according to
Yep, exactly. So look at the things that we keep seeing there: knowledge, wisdom, spiritual understanding. But also, it's not that Paul is saying that there's no growth that you can experience, that there's no growth that you have left to do. He's definitely saying you have growing that you can do. But where is that growth founded? It's founded on the not the fleshly wisdom or the carnal wisdom that these. Again, he hasn't gotten there yet. I'm getting ahead of Paul a bit, but not the carnal wisdom that we're going to read about in chapter 2 and chapter 3, but rather the spiritual wisdom that Paul had delivered to them. And by the way, what's that going to look like when he says walk worthy of the Lord? What does that look like as he keeps going there? Fully pleasing him, being fruitful in every good work, increasing in the knowledge of God. So yes, you have this knowledge. I gave it to you. And yet there is more that you can mine if you mine it from the right place. And then strengthened with all might. What's he worried about? He's worried about them drifting. I forget. I've just been re-listening to the classes that we've had on Colossians in the past, and somebody was I forget who, maybe Andrew was saying when he taught last time that it isn't so much, sometimes it's clear that there's some rebellion going on that Paul has to deal with. There doesn't seem to be so much rebellion on the part of the Colossians, but just a drifting under the influence of some of this false teaching. And so he's really wanting them to be strengthened, grounded, and as he says, according to that is to say God's or Jesus' glorious power, for all patience and long suffering with joy. We're going to talk about some asceticism when we get into chapter 2. Is there some suffering that goes along with this? Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's artificial, self-imposed, self-absorbed, I might even say, self-absorbed, and vain suffering that somebody undergoes. It's not that there's no suffering when you're a Christian, but it's not this artificial stuff that is to no avail. I think Paul is saying, yes, you need to undergo you're going to undergo some suffering, but it's going to be for the right reason, not for these things that are made up. So again, notice the way everything that Paul says, he's looking forward to the attack that he's finally going to launch directly on the false teachings that have come in there. All right, let's see here. All right, so moving on into question number 8. By the way, y'all stop me. I know I'm always bad to stop and ask for questions, but stop me if anybody has anything you want to add to anything that we talk about here. So we move into verses 12 through 14. The Father had granted the Colossians a number of blessings. Somebody tell me what those are, and then we'll talk a little bit about those.
They would share in the inheritance.
Go ahead.
That they were able to share in the inheritance of the saints.
Okay.
They were rescued from the domain of darkness, transferred into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom they have redemption and forgiveness of sin.
Okay. You have anything to add to that, Larry?
He got it right.
Okay, yeah, I'd say. Well done, Brant, well done. You consider yourself approved there, rightfully handling the Word of God. All right, yes, so all four of those things qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints of light. I think when Jacob was teaching Ephesians, there was a discussion about that word inheritance, at least as it was used in Ephesians, and Jacob said, is it the inheritance that the saints receive, or is it an inheritance that God receives? And I think your conclusion there in Ephesians was, I think we're probably talking about an inheritance that God enjoys, a heritage that God enjoys. I think here, though, and this is not to argue with Jacob, I think here he says the inheritance of the saints in the light. So this is an inheritance that we enjoy, being in the light, being in Jesus, being a part of the household of God. So he is qualified to do this. And again, notice the tenses of the verbs as we're going through this passage here. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us, present perfect, which is to say in the present at the present time when Paul is writing those things, it has already happened. It's already been completed. He has qualified you to be partakers in the inheritance of the saints in the light. Now, the other, I don't think I'm the first person to come up with this, but I just love the illustration. You know, when when you're in the room and somebody else is on the phone and you only hear one side of the conversation, sometimes you can kind of sort of piece together what they're talking about, and other times a little tough. It's hard to say for certain, but my suspicion is a number of the things, a number of the particular words that Paul focuses on here, the inheritance of the saints in the light. I wonder if those were not some things that the false teachers, if that was not some language that they were using and using improperly. And so Paul said, no, let me tell you how this actually applies. So he says, he has qualified you to be let me say it right, qualified you to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in the light. Okay, so this is not just any inheritance, it's the inheritance of being a holy one, and it has to be in the light. And what is that light? Well, we'll cover that some more as we get further into the letter. He has delivered us from the power of darkness. Were the false teachers somehow indicating that, well, no, there's still some darkness that's dwelling in you? And Paul says, no, God's delivered you from all that. He's delivered you from all that, and you are now in the kingdom of the Son of his love. That darkness no longer has any power over you. Again, sounding a lot like Romans. And then finally, in whom we have redemption. Were they introducing some doubt with regard to, well, how many have we really been saved? Have we really been redeemed? He says, yes, you have been redeemed. And specifically, what am I talking about when I say redeemed? The redemption that we're talking about, the forgiveness of sins, which he'll get to the means of that here in just a minute. So again, notice how all of these are either present or present perfect. This is happening now. They already enjoy these things. So this should be a great boost of confidence to the people in Colossae. All right. So let me stop there. Anything that we've talked about so far that anybody would like to comment upon before we get into talking about the firstborn? All right. So let me just read through this passage, and then I want somebody to tell me, so now how is it that we are supposed to understand? I mean, Paul uses the word firstborn. How are we supposed to understand that as anything other than, well, obviously, Jesus was the first created being, and then he created all things after that. So let's read this together. Verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. So, why do we conclude, no, he's not talking about first in order of birth, he's talking about preeminence. He's using this term firstborn as more of a title and not so much a description.
Brad, Brother Weaver pointed out that this is, there's only one place where it's used in a literal sense, the word firstborn, and that's at the birth of Christ. And so first, our thing is to figure out, is it literal or physical? And it's or figurative, and it's definitely figurative.
Okay. So definitely fit. There's really only, when you survey the New Testament, there's only one place where it's used in a literal sense. Okay. Anything else?
Well, in Hebrews 11 or 12 rather uses the term in a plural form to the festival gathering and assembly of the firstborn. So we're firstborns, which really isn't possible outside of a figurative sense, and so that just points to the privileged place that we hold. We've become not just children of God, but firstborn. We've become a part of that privilege and so forth, that status as firstborn. And then in addition to that, it says, in just a few verses down from verse 15, the firstborn from the dead. And so it points to not just his firstborn status as Mary's son or whatever, or even from God, but just the
Yeah, so number one, I like what you did. Now, look, for the purposes of studying an epistle, I really like to stay as much as possible in the text of the epistle. It's easy to come to some really bad conclusions if you read an epistle and find a phrase and think, well, I think I've seen that phrase someplace else, and just without any critical thinking assume that they're talking about the same things. We can come to some really bad conclusions. So I really like to stay in the text, maintain the context and the flow of thought. And yet, that doesn't mean that we just forget everything that we know about the rest of the Bible. What is it Kevin says? Well, if this was the only verse that said something about Jesus and his nature, well, we might be justified in concluding, well, yes, Jesus is the firstborn created, the first created thing. And yet, we still have John chapter 1. Nothing that was made, how does he put it? Nothing was made that he didn't make. That's not how it puts it. I guess I'm just going to have to read it because I can't get it right. Here we go. All things were made through him, and without him nothing that was made was made. Okay, there's no room to leave anything else. Jesus is before all things. We have John 8:58. Before Abraham was, I am. We have Hebrews chapter 1, where Psalm 102 is what the Hebrew writer quotes from, and he says this is talking about Jesus. And if you look back at Psalm 102, this is very clearly addressed to the Lord. Okay, so we have the rest of the Bible to look at and to give us, nice word for Colossians, grounding, that keeps us grounded in the nature of who Jesus is. And so it is unfair for somebody to say, now listen, you have to set all that aside, and we just want to look at this part of the text. What does firstborn? Well, no, firstborn means what it means in the context of the rest of the New Testament, okay? Not to mention the fact that, as Leonard pointed out, even in other places, and as Stephen pointed out, even just a few verses down, it's not even really used in a literal fashion there. So the rest of the New Testament has to accord with the conclusion that we come to here. Marshall.
And verse 16 has that little word because or for, which explains why he is the firstborn over all creation. It's because all things were created in him. And so if Jesus is the first created thing, then how does the next verse explain that? What it's explaining is, why does he have preeminence over it? It's because he created all things.
Yes, exactly. Well put. So again, this is all about preeminence. This is all about authority. And to bring us back to the context, why is Paul dwelling on this? Why are we dwelling upon this? Well, because we're going to see things like worship of angels that apparently folks are trying to push on the Colossians. Worship of the angels, where does that come from? Now, why are we worshiping angels when we have the very being who created all of the angels? This is where you number one, this is where all authority lies, and number two, this is where you're going to find all the treasuries of knowledge and wisdom, as he puts it. All right. Any other points about? Yeah.
I was just going to point out too that this language identifying Jesus as a creator. You could go back to Genesis, where God himself is clearly identified as the creator. And so, to someone reading this who would have known about the description of creation in Genesis, they clearly would have made that connection that Jesus is God, and therefore it's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put. All right, I said I would maybe take the first bell for us to talk about a theme verse. So why don't we pause and do that for just a minute? What did you all find as a theme verse? And then if we have time after that, we'll pick up with question 10 and probably won't get quite through all of the rest of chapter 1, but I'm just to let you know, not too worried about that. We've covered a lot of chapter 4, if I can put it that way, a lot of chapter 4 in some of the introductions. So I'm not as worried about good time. So what did you find as a theme verse or a theme passage as you read through Colossians here? We may have just read it.
I have 7 of them.
Okay.
Perfect 7.
Okay. Well, maybe pick your favorite. I don't know.
No, this is not my favorite.
Okay.
They're all my favorites.
Okay.
3, 1 through 4.
Okay. 3, 1 through 4. All right.
If then you are risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, which Christ sits on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. You are dead. Your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then you shall also appear with him in glory.
Okay. That's a good one. did you want to share one of your other 6?
Verse 17.
Okay.
Created you and work in need to all men, Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father by him.
Yeah, that's a hard one to argue with. That's good. Any other ones? Let's see, Bryce first and then Marshall.
Just a partial from 1 verse 27, Christ in you, the hope of glory. I mean, that's really a lot of what this whole thing is about is you should take on Christ, and that is where our glory, our hope is.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Another one that's hard to argue with. Are you going to argue with it, Marshall?
I'll add to it.
There we go.
Just 2:3. In him are all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge hidden. With the theme of him praying for them to have wisdom and knowledge, and then talking about a false wisdom and knowledge, it's tying it back to in Christ. That's where all wisdom and knowledge is found.
Yeah, yeah. Any others? Travis?
Where we were at in the discussion there in verse 18, right? That Christ is the head of the body and also has preeminence.
Christ is the head of the body, has the preeminence. Any others?
Colossians chapter 2 and verse 9 and 10.
Okay.
For in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in him who is the head of all principality and power.
Yeah, that one is, it's definitely a competitor for my favorite. I ended up going with another one, but it's a competitor. David?
In 110, 2:6, and 4:5, you see a walk that is
I'm sorry,
worthy
is
of
your name Tony? I'm sorry, no. Okay. What's 110, that was the first one?
110, 2:6, and 4:5.
Okay.
It speaks of a walk that is worthy of Christ versus in 3:7, once how we used to walk.
Yes, yes, yeah, all very good. All right, so I guess if there were a prize, I'd have to give it to Marshall. Marshall and I were kind of on the same page. Of course, he starts in Colossians 2, verse 1, talking about this conflict that he has, but he wants them to be, as he says there, their hearts to be encouraged, being knit together in love, attaining to all the riches of the full assurance of understanding. In other words, I want you to know you already have what you need. You don't need to add anything to it. You don't need to let anybody undermine your confidence. All the riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the knowledge of the mystery of God, both of the Father and of Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So I would say, insofar as Paul's purpose in this letter, I'd consider that to be the theme verse. But I wouldn't even thumb wrestle you on the ones that you all picked. Those are all very good, very good. All right, we might have just a little bit more time. Was that a hand, Andrew? Nope. Okay. All right. Let's see. I'll just leave that up there. So having said that, let's go back to our questions. Coming into verse 19, therefore, what was Jesus, in other words, he has the preeminence. We've established that. So then what did that qualify him to do, and by what means there in verses 19 through 22?
But it was through his blood,
All right.
that he shed on the cross, that he reconciled all things to himself, having peace and the ability to present the Colossians holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight.
Yeah, that's good. I like how you brought that out, presenting the Colossians holy and blameless, above reproach. And again, as we said before, notice how the tenses of all these verbs, they're either present or present perfect. This is not yet to come. This is happening or has happened already. So more confidence building that Paul is doing in their salvation and the teaching that they have received. We'll pick up with verse 23 and question number 11 on Wednesday. Thank you all for your kind comments and participation.